Coming up in yet another Globetrotters playbook extravaganza, it's Athens in Greece. Now, you know it for the Acropolis and being the birthplace of democracy, but at the end of this episode, you'll associate it with Barry White, a masturbating philosopher and his link to the Beatles, and why a British Prime Minister almost ruined my holiday. That and much, much more. Enough of the high-energy podcast intro. Here's some Greek street music. And that was genuinely recorded on the laneways of Athens. Now, before we go any further, if you are one of the thousands of subscribers who've made this podcast a chart-busting sensation, then you will know that sport is always weaved into my travels. It's what marketing types would call a USP. To be honest, not particularly you, but I maintain that it is an SP. And what better place to come to than Athens, home of the Olympics, for a little bit of sport. More on that to come. Well, I've already been to Athens. It was back in 2002. It was August. It was very hot. Now, this trip had a defining impact on my life because it inspired me to jack in my job and travel the world. So if it hadn't been for Greece, I may now have been a captain of industry floating around the Med on my super yacht and not secreted away in my office come attic on a drizzly day in England, spouting ill-prepared drivel. But if you like your travel tips sprinkled with drivel, then don't touch that dial. So, how did I come to be in Athens? Well, my wife, my daughter and I were making the most of something called a school wellness weekend, which essentially meant the kids got to take the Friday and Monday off school in the last weekend of November. So finally a chance to look for flights without that horrific price magnifying effect of the school holidays. We went from Heathrow with Aegean Airlines. It was £160 each for a return trip, and I've just been looking now, and the equivalent flights in May half term are available for £430, and that's if you take your kids out of school at lunchtime on the Thursday, the day before they break up. So pretty hefty. Now, the flight took about 4 hours. We arrived in Athens just after 10 p.m. Now, I don't know about you, but when I enter any country, I like to be accompanied by the sounds of Barry White singing "I Can't Get Enough of Your Love, Baby." Well, thankfully the Greeks are all over that, and they'd arranged to have the Walrus of Love's second most requested hit coming through the airport's PA system. Why is it that these are the kind of things that stick in your mind when you go travelling? Anyway, less Barry White, more about Athens, and we booked an Airbnb bang in the centre of the city. As we were feeling rather flash, we took a taxi there for €41 from the airport. If we'd been a little bit braver, then we could have taken the train. It was a 3/4 of an hour journey, and it would have cost €9 each. The apartment was in an area called Plaka, which is known as the neighbourhood of the gods. We were drawn to it because we live in Reading and we wanted somewhere that would remind us of home. We knew that it was a few hundred metres from the hill of Acropolis, and it looked perfect in the pictures, and it really was in real life. Throw in the fact that it cost just over £200 for 3 nights, and we felt pretty pleased with ourselves. I'll leave a link to this Airbnb and various other links in the show notes. A brief detour now. I'm going to take you over the Ionian Sea to Italy. I was in Rome a few years back and went on a catacombs and aqueducts bike tour. It was very good indeed. I'd never done anything like it before, but since then I've been an absolute sucker for bicycle sightseeing. It's a really good way to get your bearings in a city, so that's what we did first thing. We headed off from the Flat Tyres bike shop in Athens. We got a real flavour of all the big hitters, if you like, that we intended to visit, and some that we hadn't heard of, which was incredibly valuable. For example, the Syri neighbourhood with cool little cafes, shops and markets selling all kinds of ancient and not so ancient tat, and I mean that in a very good way. There seemed to be a whole place dedicated to Bakelite phones from the 1970s. Just my kind of tat. And we headed back there the next day. Really was well worth visiting. And this cycling trip gives me the opportunity to keep the very loose sports-based narrative of the podcast going, because our guide Stavros took us to the Panathinaikos Stadium, which held the opening and closing ceremonies of the 1896 Olympics. That's the first modern-day Olympic Games. But the first stadium was built on the site back in 330 BC. They don't really have sports there these days, but there is one exception. Here's a very, very badly recorded clip of Stavros imparting a bit more info.
And once per year, it was 2 weekends ago, it is open when we have the Athenian classical marathon race in Athens. The marathon race, even back then, was beginning from marathon, ending up to Panathinaikos Stadium. And once per year, we have the classical route, the classical marathon, and the end is on Panathinaikos Stadium.
Now, in case you didn't get that, Stavros was talking about the annual marathon race that starts at Marathon and ends at the stadium. And you'll probably also have gathered that there was an awful lot of traffic to be negotiated on the bike ride. Which brings me to another tale that Stavros told us about a Greek politician who gave all kinds of promises about making Athens a green city, only to fail miserably. Now, Stavros told us this as we made our way along a major cycle path that was being turned back into a road. I, of course, shook my head and raised a fist to the sky in outrage, which isn't easy when you're riding a bike. And much as I believed every word that Stavros was telling us, I thought it best to delve a little bit deeper, lest I libel anyone. And this is what I've managed to find. Back in May 2020, a former Athens mayor called Kostas Bakialanis, I think that's correct, I've had a good go at it, sorry Kostas if you're listening, he was in charge of a project called The Great Walk, which was an ambitious plan to really transform the traffic-clogged downtown and put in bike lanes and pedestrian walkways and the like. Former car lanes were going to be repainted in bright colours, filled with plants and benches, that kind of thing. Really beautify the place. But then came the pandemic, and post-lockdown Athenians began using their cars far more than before. The restrictions that had been put in place, they weren't in force, and regular traffic tried to squeeze into far fewer lanes than before, and there was chaos. Cue a public outcry, and 6 months and 1.8 million euros later, the mayor admitted that the project had failed. He was replaced in January 2024 by Haris Doukas. Again, that's probably not how you say it. He campaigned to develop Athens into, and stop me if you've heard this one before, a green city. Good luck with that. Okay, let's get to the if you go to Athens, you've got to go to the moment of the episode, which is of course the Parthenon. Not to be confused with the Acropolis, which is the hill upon which the Parthenon sits. So in brief, you go to the Acropolis station metro stop, you walk to the gate of the Acropolis, you pay your money, you walk past some ruins, you get to the top, you see a bigger ruin at the top, but this one has got pillars, you take a selfie, you get someone to take a picture of you, make sure that it's a profile shot whilst you pout and bend your legs slightly to get the maximum effect. Fail to really appreciate the magnitude of the place, head back down again, post on Instagram about what an inspirational experience it was. Now, rather cleverly, I have used cynicism, a school of thought in ancient Greek philosophy, to describe the actions of Philistines, who, as well as being a derogatory term for those who don't appreciate the finer things of life, is also the name of a people who originally come from the Aegean, possibly Crete, which is part of Greece, of course. Now, before any Philistines write in to complain, I must point out that the etymology of Philistine and Philistine is completely different. There probably were some Philistines who were Philistines, but that is not why they were called Philistines. Here's a rather less flippant take on the Parthenon experience. Yes, there are young scallywags looking for that perfect social media sunset. But I've been to plenty of world-famous landmarks where there are far more. And if you do a little bit of reading and use your imagination, it really is a special experience. One thing that has stayed with me is just the number of times it's been destroyed, abandoned, fallen into ruins and rebuilt. And let me give you an example. In 1687, Athens was being defended against invaders. The Parthenon was being used as a place to store gunpowder. You can probably see what's going to happen. The enemy were firing shots from a nearby hill. They hit, the place exploded, and it's never really been the same. But thankfully, at least some of the most important parts of the structure are being looked after in the British Museum, so if it happens again, those bits will be safe. More on that later. So, as per usual, the idea is to throw in a unique sporting experience, or at least something that's a little bit different. And in this case, it's rugby league in Athens. I've been speaking to George Stylianos from the Greek Rugby League Federation. You can hear the entire interview in the next episode of the podcast, which is available right now. But here's a taste, and if you're wondering why it's being conducted remotely and not in person, well, there is a good story behind it, but you'll have to listen to the whole interview to find out.
Okay, so born in Australia to Greek parents, and growing up they were bringing us back and forth quite a bit, and I got from a young age an obsession with Greece. And I always kind of half joking, half serious said, I'm going to move there one day. So when I was in 2008, just finished my university degree in Brisbane, and I thought it's a now or never moment, do I look for a full-time job or do I make a dash over and just see what happens? I could be back in a month. I might never be back. Sort of completely open-minded. So yeah, moved over. Worked a lot of odd jobs, mostly in tourism. I did my military stint because that's mandatory for males in Greece. So I got that out of the way. And then it wasn't until 2012 until I met another guy named Tassos, who was, he kind of had a fallout with rugby union. He was involved with them at one stage, and then he had a few players come with him. He had literally three players with him. And then he said, because I'd put a Facebook page up saying, let's start Greek Rugby League and all that. So we got in touch. We found a little five-a-side field to train on. And then, word of mouth numbers started growing from there. And then in 2013, it really took off. We did a Facebook advertising campaign, which went really well, brought in loads of players. And then we were able to set up 4 teams. 3 teams in Athens. One was Rhodes Rugby Union, which defected to rugby league. And then, it's been a real roller coaster since then, but it's gotten stability, you could say, in the last 2 years since we got government recognition.
That was George Stylianos from the Greek Rugby League Federation. Right, before the finale of the show, a few quick-fire travel bits and pieces that I haven't been able to shoehorn in elsewhere. We went in late November. The daytime weather hovered around 18 degrees Celsius. That's 66 degrees Fahrenheit. The nighttime temperature was about 1 layer on the jumper and trouser scale, and there wasn't a drop of rain. Food-wise, as you would expect, it was incredibly good. Bits and pieces that may be of interest. We went to a rooftop terrace. We fancied giving that a go. A bit of a mixed experience. Incredibly friendly service, but just very, very slow. When the portions did arrive, they were absolutely massive, and the size of the portion seemed to be pretty much the case for everywhere we ate out. For example, there was one place right in the centre of Athens where they gave us the biggest slabs of meat I've ever seen. 6 months later, and I still haven't digested it. I'm also a sucker for gyros, or let's face it, we call them kebabs, and I found a lovely place where I could get them for €3. So breakfast, lunch and dinner sorted every day. I haven't mentioned the famous Monastiraki Square and the windy streets that go off it like spokes in a wheel, and all the little markets there and thereabouts, with, it turns out, The big bonus being the world's worst Mickey Mouse impersonator. Something to look out for. If you've been there and you've seen him, you'll know what I mean. I also haven't mentioned the spectacularly short funicular trip up Lycabettus Hill. Gives you a wonderful view of the city and its surrounds. It's a very popular haunt for young types who've brought their own bottles of wine in a sensible bid to save themselves a few euros at the Hilltop restaurant. My wife and I had a flask of tea. Lovely stuff. I also haven't mentioned the Syntagma Square, where you'll see the changing of the guard, the main ceremony being at 11 on a Sunday morning. You get smaller ceremonies at 11 o'clock every hour, every day. I've also not mentioned the tram that takes you all along the Athens Riviera. Really good fun. We got off, had a paddle in the very warm sea on a Saturday morning, whilst my daughter's football match back home in the UK was cancelled because of a frozen pitch, and we felt very smug. I've also not mentioned our failed attempts to go island hopping from the main Athens port of Piraeus to Aegean Island, which was foiled by cancelled ferries and a miserable ticket lady. You may well get better luck if you go at a different point of the year. Regarding the ferries, that is, I can't promise anything about the demeanour of the ticket lady. That's a lot of things I haven't mentioned that have now been mentioned. But this is the end of the episode, and here are a couple of more things that I teased you with back at the start. Number 1. Philosophers pleasuring themselves in barrels. And I use this common euphemism to avoid getting hit with an explicit warning by the podcast police. The original draft of this script was much, much fruitier. This story begins at the Agora on the slopes of the Acropolis, which, in the very simplest terms, was where it was all happening for Athenians back in antiquity. It was kind of a meeting place, calm market area, that kind of thing. It gradually fell into ruin before being excavated from around 1930. If you like that kind of thing, which I do, then it's incredible. For example, just Google the Stoa of Attalos and you'll see what I mean. Back in antiquity, the big names in philosophy used to gather there. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and a chap called Diogenes, who was the founder of cynicism, which, to sum up in an incredibly clumsy way, means living with the bare necessities and rejecting things that are meant to make you happy. For example, possessions. Indeed, some people think that John Lennon was channeling Diogenes when he wrote "Imagine no possessions, it's easy if you try," whilst sitting at a Steinway piano at a Grade 2 listed country house, which is now worth over £100 million. Anyway, Diogenes took this lark so far that he lived naked in a barrel near the Agora. All folded into this belief system was that everything he did in private, he should be able to do in public, hence public playing with himself. Now, there's no evidence of John Lennon taking things this far, although if you do take a look at the Two Virgins album cover, he and Yoko do get pretty close. I also, earlier on, hinted at the actions of a British Prime Minister doing his best to wreck my trip. Step forward, Mr. Rishi Sunak. Coincidentally, he was meant to meet his Greek counterpart in London whilst we were in Athens. The Greek PM was keen to talk about the Elgin Marbles, a key part of the Parthenon, which under dubious circumstances, shall we say, were taken from Athens by the Brits in the 19th century. The Greeks want them back. Rishi doesn't want to talk about it, so he snubbed the Greek PM. The people of Greece weren't happy, exemplified by the front page of a newspaper carrying a photo of Rishi with the words "F you" next to him. Thankfully, the kind and generous folks of Athens didn't hold this against me and my family, and they even forgave us when we bought the wrong tickets for the train to the airport. Lovely people. Time for the traditionally trite travelogue ending. We really loved it in Athens. It was wonderful, a fantastic place to mooch around, a moocher's paradise indeed. You cannot swing a cat without hitting something that's been soaked in history, even if you bring a small cat with you. And we all agreed that we'd love to come back. So much so that only yesterday we booked another holiday to Greece. And if you know of any self-pleasuring philosophers on the island of Kefalonia, do let me know. It's the ultimate individual sport, so it will fit into the podcast theme. Everything you've just heard is just my opinion. My hand has not been forced. I have no skin in the game or horse in the race. Sadly for my bank balance, no money has changed hands. Thanks for listening to the Globetrotters Playbook, and goodbye.